Hi there, this is Solid Ronan from Solid Ronan Films, and welcome to part 8 of my Claude Chabrol series. And this episode features 1970s Boucher, or The Butcher, starring Stéphane Adran and Jean Yan, who was in This Man Must Die. And again, it's a fairly simple story, but this is probably my favourite Chabrol. Certainly the first Chabrol that I saw. So I'm just going to tell you a bit about the film, and then there will be spoilers later on. This is probably the best film to start with Chabrol if you've never seen any Chabrols. So this takes place in the lovely French countryside, and it's a story about Helene, played by Audran, who is a school teacher who's been in the village for about 10 years after the end of a painful relationship, and Paul, played by Jean Yan, who is the local butcher, who has spent 15 years in the army and is now returned home. His father was a butcher before him, who he didn't like. He only came back 7 years ago for his mother's funeral. And their relationship, which kind of starts off at a local wedding. One of the other school teachers is being married, so we start off with a lovely pastoral wedding scene, and then, as usual with Chabrol, it's a bit of a slow burn, but then we hear news from kids in the playground that a woman has been found dead in the woods, stabbed to death. But again, it's kind of in the background. It's not really the main focus of the story. Our main focus is the relationship between Helene and Paul. Audran, as usual, just looks fantastic, and is the picture of French chic as she strolls around the village streets, smoking, which is partly controversial for a single woman to be smoking in the streets in those days. The film opens up with the opening credits over cave paintings, and there is a visit to caves later on in the film. And again, it's this kind of idea that savagery, no matter how kind of intellectual we try and get, savagery is always in our nature, and it's always there. Because again, killing each other and going to war is pretty much one of the few things that we actually do well, or continue to do. Paul talks about, the things he's seen, the dead bodies he's seen in Algeria and Indochina. There's a lovely scene in the woods where the two of them and two children are looking for mushrooms, and Helene gives Paul a lighter for his birthday. And then we go to the school trip to the cave visit. So again, the kind of talking about our forefathers and our history and obviously savagery, and then the children have lunch, and there's a wonderful scene where one of the girls thinks it's raining, but to quote Slayer, it's raining blood, and there's a beautiful shot of blood on our nice buttered bread, and there's an overhanging hand off the edge of the rocks above them. Stefan Audran goes up and sees the body, and she sees a lighter that is the same model as the one that she gave Poe Paul. So at this point I'm going to go into spoilers, so if you haven't seen the film, stop the video and go watch the film and come back if you like. What I will say is, this is another masterful Chabrol. Again, it's deceptively quiet. He doesn't go for big bombastic moments. The music is very understated. There's a couple of magnificent scenes in the film, which I'm about to talk about, in spoiler country. But the music, he decides not to have any music. He doesn't have bombastic dun 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 kind of music that some other directors would maybe use. There's that tinkling piano even early on in the film. So again, for people who have watched lots of films, you know, tinkling piano means there's something not quite right. It's beautifully shot. Again, why we don't have Chabrol films on Blu-ray apart from the first two is a bit of a mystery to me. It's beautifully shot, beautifully acted. It has another wonderful Chabrol ending. Again, it's about the nature of humans and why do we, no matter what we try and do, we can't get away from our savage side. Now, whether that is caused by the choices you make in life or the careers you make in life, but that savagery is always there. So I would certainly highly recommend this film, but I'm now going to go into spoilers. So if you've made it this far, you've either seen the film or you don't mind having the film spoiled. Again, it was made in 1970. So the second victim turns out to be the bride from the wedding. So it's one of our teacher's wives. And they get the police from the city up, because the country police aren't really built to handle this kind of thing. And it also turns out that neither of the victims, they're both killed the same way, but neither of the victims were sexually assaulted, so they were just killed. So obviously, after finding the lighter, Helene has it in her mind that Poe Paul is the killer. And there is one of the greatest scenes in cinema history, as far as I'm concerned, one of the best scenes in cinema history. Poe Paul comes over with a jar of cherries, and the two of them sit eating cherries and spitting out the pips into an ashtray. And again, there's no music, but obviously Audran thinks that Poe Paul is the killer, so she's very on edge, and Poe Paul's sitting there talking about what a shame it is for the other teacher, and don't think of the woman who was killed, you know, as you found her. Think of her at the wedding and being happy, and And of course Audran is just getting more and more upset, but while she's still delicately eating cherries, and you literally can cut the tension with a knife. And then Audran asks for a light for her cigarette, and of course Paul produces his lighter, and Audran almost recoils slightly before taking the light, and then she starts crying again, but it's tears of relief because he's actually got the lighter that she gave him. So the lighter she found at the murder scene must be somebody else's. It's just so well shot, and again, he doesn't use music, so it's not stylized in any way. It's just two actors really having great chemistry. Audran's fantastic as she goes from this man's the killer to just a sense of relief that he's not. It's obviously somebody else with another lighter. And then we get the funeral scene, which is quite interesting because it's a almost cinematic trope now that funerals, it's raining. Well, the funeral in Le Boucher, it's absolutely stoating it down, as we might say in Scotland. It's horizontal, it's vertical, it's like bouncing off the ground, and everybody gets absolutely drenched. You can hardly actually see the funeral itself because the rain is like so heavy. And again, the policeman's there just asking questions and things like that. So another victim turns up. So that's victim number 3. Now during this time, Paul is doing some decoration of Helene's flat above the school, and he opens the drawer that she's put the other lighter in, so he recognises the lighter, and he takes the lighter back, so he now has 2 lighters. So pretty much we have the idea that Paul is the killer, if we don't already by the title of the film. And then he comes back to visit Helene at night, and she has realised that the lighter is gone, so she's back to being obviously rather nervous about Paul. So there's a great scene as she runs about locking all the doors and all the windows, and then again the classroom's kind of dark, and then we hear Paul's voice because he snuck in through the woodshed. So he comes to her and confesses, which again is kind of unusual in films, but he confesses to her. He shows her the knife, and again there's another fantastic scene where he's standing there with the knife, she's up against the wall, and she thinks he's going to kill her, so she just closes her eyes and the camera fades out. It fades to black, but then it fades back in, and Paul has stabbed himself because he's just so ashamed of what he's done. But again, he can't help it. He says he's got a compulsion to do it. So again, I think the reason that Le Boucher is so good is because, very much like Carol Boehm's character in Peeping Tom, you have some empathy for Paul, despite the fact he's done these terrible things. He's not a monster, he's not a caricature, which you could argue his character was in the previous Chabrol film, This Man Must Die. Whereas in Le Boucher, you actually like the guy, and you can see that, you know, he's tortured. Again, not condoning what he did, but again, it brings up the question of, you know, being in the army, seeing the atrocities that he saw, and also slaughtering animals for a living. What kind of toll does that take psychologically on someone? Obviously not everybody in the army or not every butcher kills people. That's ridiculous. But it just gives you that, with obviously the reference to our ancestors, and the savagery that just runs underneath human beings as a race. So again, that's a fantastic scene that is done so well. Again, not with music. So he's bleeding out and he asks Helene to help him, which she does, because she obviously cares for the guy, and she takes him in her car, a Citroen obviously, to the hospital, and they have a conversation in the car where he pretty much tells her that she's the only one that was pretty much keeping him alive, and he was able to shut out everything else when he thought of her. I mean, I'm not romantic in the least, unless it's doomed romance or failed romance, but there is part of me that wants them to like somehow come through it, even though he's killed 3 women. And then they get to the hospital where something happens. So I've done huge spoilers, but I'm not going to do the spoiler. I'm not going to tell you the ending. He either lives or he dies. And again, Chabrol does this in just a wonderful way that, again, not many other filmmakers would do. And again, the final images in the film, again, are another Chabrol fantastic ending, but again, not many other directors would maybe do. So I've spoiled big chunks of it, but I'm not going to tell you the ending, just in case you've got to this bit. But it is my favourite Chabrol. If you happen to have watched my alphabet of favourite films, it's in the letter B. And if I ever get around to doing this imaginary top 150 or whatever, it probably would be in it. Again, it's Audran and Jean Yan. I'm probably not pronouncing his name correctly, I apologise. Are just so fantastic. They've got great chemistry. Audran goes obviously through the mill in this film. It's just beautifully mounted. Again, the soundtrack is cut back a bit, but it's still beautifully done. Again, tinkling piano. Never forget tinkling piano. And it's just a great film. So thank you very much for watching. Please let me know what you think of Le Boucher, if you've seen it. And hopefully we'll see you again for another Claude Chabrol episode. So thanks very much for watching. This is Solitude saying farewell.